I thought I would begin addressing the theme of this year's festival, which is belief. So I was thinking a lot about fiction, which is make-believe in some ways. But you've dedicated yourself to fiction as a writer and as a teacher. And I wonder, what is your belief about fiction? What holds you to fiction?
You know, how to answer that without sounding like a cliche, but I do think that we are shaped by the stories that we tell as a culture, and that the stories that tell the truth about what it is to be alive are often not the stories that are in the newspaper, but are the stories that we read in fiction. So it comes at life from a different perspective, and at least affords the opportunity, it seems to me, to get closer to what it actually is like to be alive on the planet.
So that sort of texture of life,
and interiority.
Interiority, yeah.
Interiority. I think I feel that so much of our experience never breaks the surface, and so much of how we understand ourselves and would define ourselves, and the things that we think of as the most important experiences in our lives are often never, they don't manifest, or manifest only as very small gestures or small exchanges.
It's interesting that you just said small, because I was thinking sound bites. We live, especially now, with tweets and all this quick, and by definition it's too simplified compared to the texture of our experiences in our lives.
Yes, and back to the thing of if how we understand ourselves comes from the stories that we tell, what will happen to our understanding of ourselves if our stories are all sound bites? I don't know.
Yes, and that communion that you get in fiction, and that rich interiorized fiction, I mean, I know that people still value it, but it seems that we're always having to kind of reassert that. That people talk about long-form journalism like that's something, different than journalism should be. Or in novels, people talk about, well, is it a literary novel or is it a popular novel? Like, well, popular novels can be literary if they're written with that interior view and that depth of that dimension.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things, I'm with you on both of those things, and one of the things that I there's so many things to fret about nowadays. One of the things that I fret about is well, there are many things I fret about, but one of the things I fret about in literary terms is our increasing laziness, right? That actually, there's a wonderful thing that Nabokov says, that the experience of literature involves the reader and the writer climbing the mountain from different sides to meet at the top. Mm. And if you think about it, that's an experience that literature affords us, that film doesn't, right? Film comes over the top of the mountain, comes down and pulls you right up. But when you read a novel, you have to imagine it. And each of us brings to what we read our own experiences, the collection of stories that we've read before, the experiences we've lived in our lives. And so each of us has a different version. Each of us has our own unique version of a book that we read. And yet we share it. We share the experience of reading it with other people who read it. And then we have these conversations that include the experience of sort of the slippage between us, right? Because each of us has a different experience of the book. But that isn't the same with when we passively watch things, and our imagination is sort of fed rather than engaged. It's a different experience.
Oh, it really is. And that immersion and that word-by-word concentration. Claire and I were talking earlier about how we read, sort of very intensely. I was saying I always read sort of sitting up, kind of read hard, like push on the language and try to get as much out of it as I can. And I find that such an always enlightening experience. And it's communion. I mean, it's giving hours of your life to someone else's thoughts, to someone else's choices, word by word by word. And I think that's so enriching, and it's very different from other experiences.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have this. I mean, I assume everyone has this experience, and I always wonder if we have it in the same places. That sometimes, just as with a piece of music, there'll be some little phrase in the piece of music that you know, there's a, like I know there's a Beatles song in which there's a particular little phrase of the music that I love. In fiction also, there'll be some little image or some exchange, some little moment that seems to speak to you or sort of opens a window to something beyond itself. And I always wonder, do we all have the same ones? Or does each of us, like, if we actually went through it, because you don't do that in English class, right? Like, let's talk about the places where we, you know, find a little, we don't talk that, you know. But if we did, would we find that each of us has a different place or a different set of places?
Right. Well, that's, you know, I take a lot of notes, and people write quotes and, you know, keep diaries of things like that because they mean so much to the reader and to the writer. So, speaking about reading and love of books, I was so struck by your young narrator in your new book, The Burning Girl, Julia. She's a very sophisticated thinker. She's, you know, on that verge of, you know, the journey from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. And we'll talk more about the book, but I want to ask you right now about her extraordinary perception and her articulateness. And I'm thinking to myself, so is Claire Messud like this when she was a teenager? Did you keep diaries? Did you try to make sense of the world by writing things, stories, essays?
Well, luckily I could not see myself as a teenager. Luckily, I cannot tell you what I was like. But I'm sure I was a pain in the neck. But I did try. You know, one of the things that is, so the narrator is 17 when she tells the story of the book, but she's looking back at events that happened between the ages of 12 and 15. And one of the things that you know, some reviewers have said, oh, well, I feel I had all those thoughts, but I would never have expressed them so sort of straightforwardly. To which I sort of felt like, well, isn't that what art is for, right? Like, isn't art supposed to take the thoughts you have and kind of, I mean, you're supposed to be able to recognize the thoughts, but maybe think, you know, oh, isn't it handy that somebody expressed them directly? That was sort of my hope. So I don't know that she's, but I did give the manuscript, you know, to my daughter, who's now 16 but was 15 when she read it, and she was very helpful in terms of saying, you know, pointing out things that she didn't think a young person would say, and I think that overall she did not feel that. I mean, I kept having these all along the way. I kept having these weird. I don't know what we think young people are like now. Part of it I attribute to the rise of the YA novel, which means that we don't actually read anything about young people anymore. We just send them off to a separate part of the bookstore and let them read about themselves. And then we sort of think, oh, well, they're less complicated and less thoughtful than we are because they're just reading. But much of YA is actually pretty thoughtful and pretty serious. And I actually think that because it's the time in which we're forged as adults, right, in those years, and kids really think about all those really serious things, and actually, you know, a 17-year-old is much more likely, or I was at 17, like I was reading Dostoevsky, and I'm not reading Dostoevsky much now. Right? You know, I mean, I wish I were, but I'm not, and I feel like there's some sort of avidity for this sort of nakedly big questions that you have when you're young, I think.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, very much in this novel, it reminded me of the intensity of that age, the intensity of your friendships, your relationships, the things you worry about. And, you know, it really brought back to me that grappling with everything, because you are trying to figure it out. You know, you realize that you've been lied to a lot and underestimated constantly. I found being a child really frustrating, frankly. I have no nostalgia about it at all. And I read and read and read trying to figure out, you know, the world and adulthood. So I thought Julia was, you know, really an excellent narrator.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, I also think it's one of the things about adolescence that is a change, because when you're a kid, you if you don't know stuff, you figure, well, somebody else knows it, or I'll figure it out later. And then as a teenager, it's exactly that. You think, wait a minute, it's not obvious that these people know anything.
So true. But it just made me curious about yourself, if writing's been a lifelong habit for you.
Yeah. No, I had, you know, we can talk about making the stories we tell ourselves, like the family story always was. So I, of course, swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. Claire always wanted to be a writer. Claire had said she wanted to be a writer before she was 6, which is why Claire got a typewriter for her 6th birthday. It's only many, many years later that I realized, like, oh, my mother was a sort of constant letter writer, epistolary, a mad woman, like writing many, like something out of the 19th century, writing many letters a day to people. And my father's father, who was in the Navy and then in business, wrote several novels unpublished on the side. So I feel like actually the story was I sort of sprang into the world as a writer, and the reality was, like everybody else, I was like, people were standing over me saying, write. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm very happy to know that. It really shows in your work. Another theme in your work that I've always found very intriguing is your interest in complicated relationships between women, female characters. You know, the Women Upstairs, the book before this one, really brought that to a great intensity of competition and, you know, really interesting rivals in being creative and present in the world in dramatic ways. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your interest in the dynamics between women, which is not always a subject in sort of classic novels.
You know, again, this thing of not realizing how you're shaped by stuff until later. I realize now, and I actually wrote a little thing about it not long ago. In part, there were no YA books when I was young, except when we were young, there was S.C. Hinton's The Outsiders, and that was the only one. There was one. So I read what my mom had around the house, and my mom was a huge reader, and she read largely 20th century women writers. And when I was sort of coming into that age of reading grown-up fiction, sort of 11, 12, 13. It was the beginning of Virago Press. And so the Virago Modern Classics was reissuing all sorts of amazing, fairly obscure until then, Antonia White and Molly Keane and Vita Sackville West and all sorts of people that my mom must have had a subscription, or else she was just greedy and bought them all at the bookstore as they came. And so I grew up reading stories. My favorite writer when I was sort of 14, 15 was Jean Rhys. I liked it not too cheerful, apparently.
That's
so,
great.
But it meant that for me, that whole examination of women's interiority and women's stories was sort of part of my understanding. I didn't know that everybody didn't read this stuff. Like, I didn't know it was the women's studies curriculum. I thought it was just books. So, so I think that, I'm sure that's influenced me along the way.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. No, that was excellent books. Yeah, when I meet younger readers, I'm like, okay, YA novels, that's great, but read everything.
Yeah.
I mean, the big moment in my life was convincing the librarian in my hometown public library that I could go upstairs and read adult books when I was, I don't know.
Right? Why don't they want what we've got?
Right.
Like that. I feel like when I was young, I always wanted what the grown-ups had. I wanted a glass of wine. I wanted to stay up late.
Coffee, the cigarette,
right?
the wine.
I wanted the whole thing. I wanted to read the books. Right? I remember, reading. My mother had ragtime in the bathroom, and I was like, I would always use her bathroom so I could read Ragtime because it was a grown-up book, Yeah.
Oh, I raided my parents' shelves all the time. Absolutely. Yeah. That was the point. So a lot of what goes on in The Burning Girl is about telling stories, how stories are told, who gets to tell stories. And it's interesting in the beginning that you throw in a little bit of fairy tale settings. The characters, these two girls who bond in preschool, Julia Robinson, who's, sort of a larger girl with dark curly hair, and Claire Burns.
Cassie.
Oh, Cassie, sorry.
No,
Claire.
that's why I'm Claire. But they're both C.
They're C's, yeah, Cassie. Cassie Burns. You describe her as having almost white blonde hair. She's sort of bird-boned. These just felt like fairy tale characters to me, kind of the opposites. And then Julia and Cassie look at they call the woods around Cassie's house the encroaching forest. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about if fairy tales underlie this story at all.
Well, they do, yeah. And I think, having said earlier, I think we are made up as much of our literarily lived lives as of our literally lived lives, right? And the stories that form us do so as much as the experiences, often as much as the experiences that we have. And I think, that means that my father always used to say, culture is what's left when you've forgotten everything. And if you are me and you forget everything, I forget everything, then you discover that actually it's sort of been macerated and is in there somewhere and is coming out in funny ways. So when I was reading, one of the joys, I have teenage kids now, that one of the joys many joys when they were smaller was reading to them and reading with them and reading books that I had loved as a kid and books that I was discovering that didn't exist when I was a kid. But there was this book that was republished by the New York Review of Books, children's books, classics, and it's by somebody named Eric Linklater, and it's called The Wind on the Moon, and it's not a particularly well-known book, but my sister and I had loved it when we were children, and all I remembered was that we'd loved it, and it's about two girls whose father goes away because there's a war. And he says, as they're leaving, the wind is on the moon, and it means they're going to be naughty for the whole time he's gone. And but what I realized rereading it with my kids is that there were all these jokes that were were family jokes that were actually jokes from the book. And I'd completely forgotten that they came from the book. They were just, to me, family jokes, but actually they were book jokes. And I feel like back to the fairy tale thing, I feel like for kids, too, their understandings of ourselves as children comes from the stories that we're told. And two kids go into the forest is the beginning of a lot of different stories, some of which, don't go so well, all of which involve adventure and darkness. There are all these sort of symbolic seeming things in the book, throughout the book. One of the reasons I wanted her to be telling the story from 17 and not from 25 or 30 is there's a little Wordsworth reference in there. My editor made me take Wordsworth's name out. But the notion that childhood trailing clouds of glory, right? That there's this sort of magical way that kids live in the world. And love, for example, when you're a kid, animals have personalities and meaning, and then we grow up and we put away childish things and we think that, of course animals don't have, aren't actors in life, except that anybody who's here tonight who has a pet knows that your particular pet has a personality and is an actor and tells you things, right? We actually live the whole time that way, and I feel I spent my life from about 18 to about my early 40s thinking that I was moving towards the light in sort of a rational, lucid, clear, sort of, I don't know what, intellectual way of being. And then I realized that actually I really understand nothing. I've understood nothing at all. Everything is mysterious. I live again as a child, and all along I lived as a child, I just didn't acknowledge it. And those stories allow for that way of seeing the world. And if you think of Greek myths, for example, we don't read a Greek myth and say, there was a maiden, Zeus fell in love with a maiden, Hera, jealous, turned the maiden into a cow. You don't read the myth and say, wait a moment, you can't turn people into cows. You read it and you say, okay, she turned her into a cow, and then, right, and then you move on. And I wanted that to be part of the experience of the book for the characters, and also in some way for the readers. In that way, I wanted it to be not a book that gives answers, so much as a book that somehow is about the mystery.
Oh, yes, that fits so well. It's the way the book works. I won't go through and point out everything in there, though. But I do want to bring up the women's asylum. So the two girls they spend over the summer, and they spend their time in the woods, and they find their way to this abandoned mansion that had, at one point in its life, been turned into a mental asylum for women. And Julia, our very smart narrator, thinks a lot about the women that were in there and what brought them there and who decided they were crazy and what kind of crazy they were. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, is it called Bonnybrook, this play?
Yeah, it is. It is called the Bonnybrook, which is made up. Although there's probably an asylum somewhere called that.
Probably is, yeah. It makes sense
I don't know. Yeah. Well, back to the sort of fairy tale aspect, I feel like I believe, am I right? I haven't kept up with academia particularly, but I believe that Freud has now been thoroughly discredited. Is that true? We don't pay any attention to him? I feel like, where are the pillars of my youth? Freud, Marx,
yes.
Like where did they go? Everything I was raised with, the whole sort of archetypes with which I was made to understand the world now mean nothing to anyone. But if you think of it in Freudian terms, I mean, the girls go into the woods, and there's an asylum, and an asylum,
sort of like an anti-castle kind
right? An anti-castle, and an asylum has this dual meaning, which is both a refuge and a place, an institution, and a place for a type of incarceration. Yeah. It's this time, as they're approaching this time where those questions of who will they be and how will they fit into society, right? And what does it mean? What does it require of you to fit into society? Those questions are imminent for them, and actually is what that's what comes up over the subsequent years in school. Yeah.
It was, I'm always interested in structures and stories because, novels are kind of architectural. They have rooms and passageways. And it made me think back to the woman upstairs in Nora's room, that she so meticulously recreated rooms in which writers write, Emily Dickinson and even Edie Sedgwick, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I'm not sure she was writing, but
no, she wasn't writing. She was doing something outrageous. But so again, this sort of idea of these interior spaces and minds going awry, perhaps. And I wonder if that's something that that's come up in your writing in other ways, or just some theme that interests you, or.
Well, I think I suppose I'm not officially interested in madness, but I am interested in madness, and in this, I mean, especially in relation to this, where do we set a I mean, because there is also, for Nora, she also does a little diorama of Alice Neal.
Yeah, right.
At the time of the painter Alice Neal, at the time of her breakdown, and then Emily Dickinson, and then Virginia Woolf's last note. And I think there is one of the other things about adolescence is, absolutely related, is that it is this incredibly normative time, right? It's the time in which kids look up. It's the moment when you realize, I come for a sleepover at your house, and I realize, well, either your house is normal or my house is normal, but they can't both be normal. So who's normal, right? And then you're trying to figure it out. How can I make normality, and how can I fit in? And when my daughter was in middle school, she could give there were 60 kids or so in her class, and she could, without thinking, she could give you the hierarchy of popularity from 1 to 60. Like she could tell you And there were rules, like who she could talk to and who she couldn't. And you could talk to somebody 10 people more popular, but not if they were with somebody 10 people more popular than that, right? So there's this way in which you, and I always feel, especially, it was a thing I had much in my mind with The Woman Upstairs, that I always have Blood Wedding. Do people remember Lorca's Blood Wedding? That play in the back of my mind.
Oh, yeah.
It's about Spain and it's the mothers who, weeping for their sons, actually insist on sending them off to war. I feel like the mothers, there is this. I feel that women, we are often complicit in types of containment and subjugation. Wittingly or unwittingly. But if you think about sort of mothers at the school gate, in the moment when did she show up for any of the PTA meetings? I haven't seen her at a single one. I don't think she brought anything to the potluck either. I think this is the first time I've seen her picking up that kid, right? She usually sends a nanny. So I feel like we're busy setting the parameters of what's normal and acceptable.
Exactly.
And there's a reason. There are lots of reasons why it's not just women, but in society, to be a sort of autistic genius male is a sort of great thing, and to be the female version is to be crazy.
Yeah.
So I think I'm interested in terms of creativity, but also just some sense of flourishing, what the parameters are, and how soon do people come to a point where they say, you know what, not normal. She is not normal. And what happens then?
Yeah, really, really powerful. And that goes back to, the idea of, what women are supposed to do and not do. I mean, a lot of the old myths and fairy tales, there's a lot of punishment for going over those bounds. And this makes me think that it would be a good time to read that passage that we spoke about earlier.
Sure.
This is a really great example of how Julia thinks in The Burning Girl and how she's seeing these cultural storytelling.
And maybe it makes sense to say that she's just been imagining an experience that Cassie has had, that Julia has heard about from someone else, which is Cassie had sort of left home on foot at night, and a neighbor who was driving by picked her up and took her home. And the neighbor has told Julia's father, who is the dentist, that this happened, but Cassie has not told Julia. If that doesn't sound too much like an SAT, who's wearing the red dress? Okay.
Well, it was your classic scary situation. You get in a car with a man.
With the man. And then afterward, meaning after the imagining, there's the fleeting apprehension and anxiety that all the emotion and dread you experienced was a kind of pornography, a sort of made-up fear, like the fear in games of pretend or in horror films, an almost erotic titillation bred in you by your deep understanding of how stories go, how they should go, and when a teenage girl walks alone in the night, there is a story, and it involves her punishment, and if that punishment is not absolute, rape and even death itself, then it must, at the very least, be the threat of these possibilities, the terror of them. And that all the stories you've grown up with have made you feel, in that moment by the highway, not only like the victim, but like the heroine in a story someone else will tell about you. This is a rare occasion when you are the star of the show.
Thank you. Some really powerful insights in there. It's interesting that Julia gets interested in acting and telling stories. So it makes me think about, the theater of fiction and how, that you're having your characters act. But so how many layers is going on here? I mean, you're creating these characters and then they're creating characters. And how do you I'm always curious about how fiction writers kind of conceive of this. How much do you know going in? How much kind of wells up and surprises you?
I don't know. I feel like, if I'm really honest, I'm a great believer in the id, and yeah, I know, discredited now.
No, useful, still useful.
and in intuition, and I feel like a lot of it often seems to me like music, right? That there's some rhythm or some that you can feel if it's too thin. You can, it's just and there are all these things. There is that, what you're hoping for as a writer. Do you remember those moments? I feel like they happen most in college, and then maybe sometimes occasionally later in life, but where what you're reading in your philosophy class relates to the story in the newspaper, relates to something somebody says at lunch, and you're like, oh my God, harmonic convergence, like it all comes together, right? And I feel like when you're writing fiction, you're sort of trying to recreate that. And even as I say it, I teach workshop, which it's not a really good pedagogical tool. I do say to them, take a nap. If you can't solve your story, lie down, close your eyes. It can work. But I also think, one of the things about the way the world is changing, this strange utilitarian world we now inhabit, where everything is purposeful, and I feel that I understand talking to my students that they think that it can all be charted out. And as if it was like a computer program or something, and they read many. I've been reading many Alice Munro, William Trevor, and somebody else stories, and I have seen that the first 3 paragraphs they do this, and then then there's a sort of a longer paragraph that pivots. I find it's often it's a pivot paragraph comes, and I'm like, okay, okay, but they write great fiction. It's working for them, so. The discredited id, what can I say?
Now that's so interesting because, as a reviewer and critic, when things start getting technical like that in fiction, I get really back off. I mean, that's not what I want out of fiction, or even narrative nonfiction well written. I mean, it's the story. You want to be pulled through, and it feels to me that when fiction's really working, that the writer is also being taken along on some.
Right, I do. I mean, I do. I have this. So I do. I have an outline or whatever, and then because can you imagine like if you didn't? That seems just terrifying. But it changes sometimes along the way. But you know where you need to go, and then there is discovery. And if there weren't discovery, why would you bother?
Right.
Right. Why would you? If you knew already exactly what you were going to say, you wouldn't. And on the sort of mini harmonic convergence, there are these sort of moments. Anybody remember pop rocks? There are these moments that are like pop rocks, where you're like, oh, I didn't expect that, right? And characters suddenly reveal themselves or do something. You're like, oh, I thought she was going to say, but no, she's not going to say it. I actually really know her now, and she's not going to say that.
Oh, I love hearing that. So that sort of brings us to really a really deep theme in all your work, which is the mystery of other people. I mean, and I remember, I think my great love of fiction started because I was recognizing that it's really hard to get inside anyone else's psyche. I mean, even the person you're closest to growing up, your very, very best friend. And that seems something that you return to a lot, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and about that, the attempt to enter other people's realms and to find language for them,
Yeah, I think that as you're saying that, I think for me too, from very early. It must be. I feel Dr. Freud would have something to say about my recurring interest. I feel it. I remember feeling it actually as a terrible pain, like agony, when I was young. This idea that I could neither see nor be seen, right? That I mean, and I still can't get my head around when someone dies and everything in their head goes. There was a moment when I was in my 20s or maybe 30s, and my French grandfather, who lived Basically, he was born in 1905 and he died in 1997, so he lived the 20th century. He was French. And he was looking out the window. It was after my grandmother died, sometime after. He was sitting, they lived in the south of France in an apartment on a cliff above the sea, and he was sitting in the window looking out to sea. And I thought, oh, he's thinking about being old and how he misses his wife, my grandmother, whom he adored. And I said, Grand-père, what are you thinking about? And he said, I was thinking about when I visited an oil well in the Sahara in 1954. Right? Like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
right? But it's just, it was in there, and then now it's gone. And I do have some basic feeling that among other things, literature is like the cave paintings at Lascaux, right? It's what we have. It's I have a little thing, I know, everybody has it's in almost every book. These are the fragments we have shored against our ruins. Like this, I put that in there somewhere. It's always in there. I feel like this is what we have. And when I sit and I make and I'm always confused because they don't feel it the way I do at 17, 18, but I give to my undergraduates the opening of Tolstoy's Childhood. You know, his first published work was Childhood, Boyhood, Youth, and he kind of abandoned it. So with Youth, you turn the page and you're like, where's the rest? Well, he never wrote it. But Childhood opens with him waking up. I mean, it's a sort of very lightly fictionalized Tolstoy, remembering waking up being wakened by the tutor swatting a fly over his head in his room on the country estate when he was shortly after his 10th birthday. And of course, there's nobody who's like a pane of glass quite the way Tolstoy is. And when you read those pages, you know, right? You know what it was like to be an aristocratic Russian in the middle of the 19th century on a country estate, miles from Moscow. And how else would we know? I feel like no history book would tell me that. And we know in the way that we recognize and we laugh, and if we read closely, if the writer has chosen the details, if you read, if you think, I read with them The Dead too, and they're like, the dead. But if you read The Dead, every detail means, every detail counts. The tapestry on the wall above the piano when the sisters are singing and playing, like everything means and counts and is a window that opens up and you understand, oh, I guess they're the kind of Irish who like the English. Oh, okay. And then that changes the conversation. Then you understand the conversation that's happening at the party differently, right? I mean, that we have a responsibility to read carefully, but if the writer has done his or her job carefully, they give us the world.
Beautifully put. So my final question in that vein is, when you're writing now, is it, part of the artist's work to try and capture that again in this time for people reading in the future? A century from now, let's hope people are reading. Do you feel that?
I think I do feel that. I wouldn't write if I didn't. I mean, not that I'm writing for people 100 years from now. I'm hoping that, but Lord knows now more than ever we need the capacity to communicate literally across county divides. Let alone we need to understand what it's like. And I think of I often think of writing as being like a safecracker, right? You're listening. You're just listening for the clicks. There's the wonderful Chekhov line that I often tell my students: it's not my job to tell you that horse thieves are bad people. It's my job to tell you what this horse thief is like. So even though the Tolstoy, is writing in Childhood, he's writing about himself, he went on and he wrote about lots of people who weren't remotely like himself, right? And he did that by just listening. By listening and sort of not inserting himself. I feel the writer has a job to not be inserting him or herself too much. Or it depends on the fiction, right? Sometimes it's all about the I. the id, the I, whatever. I mean, I think one of the questions I have now, there's a lot of noise and distraction now. And I would say that being human, I mean, we recognize Othello, we read Othello, or we go to watch Othello, and or Hamlet, we recognize them, and the doublet and hose don't stop us. I have some, I fret about whether the little machines are changing us and whether we won't recognize. I mean, I was speaking to a friend the other day who it's a whole, but he actually is the manager of a dance company, but he was talking about the importance of our animal contact, and that it's, if you think of the things that humans need or else they'll die. Mm-hmm. Actually, animal contact is one of them, and it's becoming less and less part of our daily sort of lives. And I assume I hope we're gonna notice that and kind of correct it. But whether it makes sense to write about the noise, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think that idea of just, remembering that we're animals on a living planet, that we breathe and drink water, and also that we have empathy. I mean, it seems that literature really feeds that and supports that. And so I think it is really crucial. And I believe we'll keep doing it. I think we'll push back.
I think so too. I remember, it's now years ago, but I remember reading that I'm sure it's no longer happening, the chief of police in Mexico City made all his policemen read novels.
Oh, I like it.
For empathy purposes.
We should do reading lists for chief of police. That would be excellent. Claire, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Donna.
And thank you all for listening. And now it's your turn to ask some questions. I know there's microphones that will be passed around.
I'm wondering whether you are seeing a decline in interest in either reading or writing.
Well, I teach creative writing, so I don't see a decline in the interest in writing. Actually, every year I teach at Harvard, I teach undergrads, and every year we have more and more students applying to take writing classes of many. I mean, there are many kinds of writing classes you can take now, a much bigger range than when I was a student long ago. And those courses we can't run enough courses to satisfy the demand. So I think the reading piece is more complicated. There are some students who are insanely avid readers of a sort that baffles us all, and you feel like, how did you read 6 novels in a weekend? And yet there are people who want to write but don't read much, and that's an interesting phenomenon. So it's a big range. I think for me, one of the things that I find confusing is what people read. And one of the things, just talking about when we were young and sort of discovering things, one of the things I find unsettling is, because when I was young, I didn't have money, I didn't go to the bookstore, and I went to the library, and I plundered my parents' bookshelves. And now kids are much more aware of the world, and so they're aware of everything that's new. And so, in a way that wasn't true 10 years ago, they know the latest thing, and there's a lot else they don't know about. So I had the unsettling experience of having about half a class not know the work of Toni Morrison. We have Michael Ondaatje coming to campus in a couple weeks. Don't tell him. In one class, I drew a blank on Michael Ondaatje. And I feel like 10 years ago, there would have been, I think, that people were sort of looking a little in the middle distance, as it were, and had some greater sense of perspective. And now it's much more about the now. So, and there's great stuff going on in the now. I mean, it's not that there isn't. There's amazing stuff, but I don't know what happens if you don't have it in a bigger context.
I love your comment about someone cracking the safe and listening for the clicks. As someone who's trying to pick up on the voice of society today, what are you listening to? Where do you go? I'm sure it's not Twitter feeds. Is it going to a Starbucks and just listening on in? Do you take your students there to have them write down what they're hearing? Where would you hear the voice of society today?
Well, one of the things that I feel strongly, whether with justification or not, is that any voice is worth listening to, right? When somebody says to me, "But Julia isn't a typical 17-year-old," I say, "No, she's not a typical 17-year-old. But are you going to tell me there isn't a Julia in this country? I don't believe you. There's a Julia in this country. There's more than one." But I think the fact is that there are as many voices as we are people. And one of the wonderful things about the last 20, 30 years in this country, certainly the last 10, is that there's been a real burgeoning of diverse voices, and voices, stories being told that have not been told, or haven't been told in story form or in print. I taught a class at another university a few years ago, and I had a student who was from an Asian American community in suburban, outside San Francisco, where I think everybody was Asian, and she wrote a story about Buddhist summer camp. And I said, "You know what? I've never read that story. Like, I've read the Jewish summer camp one, and I've read the Christian summer camp one, and I've read the secular summer camp one, but I've never read the Buddhist summer camp one." And it was pretty great. Like, there were all these little different, like the Japanese family, the half Korean, half Taiwanese family. Like, there was all of this sort of cultural complication and different understanding of religion and so on. And was way cool, and I had never heard that story, never read that story before. So I think in a way you just have to, you could stand on a street corner, you could sit in a diner, you can listen to the people at your dinner table at home. I mean, any voice.
I'm wondering, in your teaching, is there a particular kind of transformation that needs to happen in a student, and has to happen you see it in many cases, for them to become good writers?
I think what I find interesting is how various people's talents are. So different transformations have to happen to different people. So there are the people who come in and they can write a beautiful sentence, but they really don't have any sense of how to tell a story. Or they're the people who come in and they can, believe me, they're the people who they can tell a great story, but they cannot write a grammatical sentence. Okay. I like that one, because there it's super straightforward. You're like, okay, Strunk and White, let's go. It seems that seems a fairly clear transformation that is practical, and you can do it. But there's a vast gamut of gifts and lacunae, right? They're the things that people are missing. So I have at the moment a student who is she writes passages as good as Alice Munro, right? I mean, she's absolutely wonderful writer, and I have no doubt will write. I think she's somebody who can't help it. She just can't not write, and I think she will write for her whole life. Right now, she cannot finish anything, which of course is a problem in a course. But so that's the transformation that has to happen for her. She has to find a way to finish a story instead of just starting them.
So I want to hear about your process. So you're talking about your student who can't finish, and all of these things are ringing clear to me with all the problems that I have when it comes to being creative and the blocks that happen. When you write, what's it like for you? What's a typical day? Are you working on your next book already? Will that be the next book that's published? Will you abandon it after a couple months, or will you stick with it? Can you talk a little bit about what your writing process is like?
I can try. You know, I have twice started things that I didn't pursue. But generally, there's a lot goes on in my head before I'm the person who wants to open the fridge and take it all out in one go. Like if I'm making breakfast and I have to do it 3 times, I messed up. You know, it's so wasteful. Refrigeration is expensive. No, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's not expensive, but do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, there's an efficiency thing. Like, I always say, this is a digression, but I always say, you know, everybody can be a really good writer. The question is the learning curve. And if it's somebody for whom the learning curve is going to take 50 years, then maybe they should do something else. So I feel about the writing, like, that's part of the having the outline, and it's like I'm not somebody who can set off on the rowboat, you know, to cross the channel and be like, hey, let's go. I'm just too OCD for that. So there is no typical day. I feel that there was all the time before I had children when I thought, when will my real life begin? There's so much time. There's so much time. And then there's the time that our daughter was born 16 and a bit years ago, and I feel like since then it's been like, when will there be time? When will there be time? But also, you know, anybody in the room with kids knows they get pink eye, and then they sprain an ankle, and then they have a friend trouble, and then they God love them, but they you know, and now they're at the age where they need to go everywhere but have no driver's license. So I write when I can. And I've got pretty unfussy about that. I have a type of pen I use, I have a type of notebook I use, and really aside from that, it can be anywhere, as long as nobody wants anything from me. Starbucks is fine. The next thing is, we'll see. We'll see. I feel like that I'm not somebody who has sort of 15 ideas going at one time in my head. I'm sort of, you know, part of my trouble with the contemporary world. I can't really keep 15 things going in my head at once. Like, I'm not a multitasker. So things have a long germination. The thing that's supposed to be next is the thing I've waited all my life to do. And then I've now reached the point where if I don't do it, I might die first. So I've just got to get on and do it. But you know that then you feel like, or maybe it won't ever happen. You know, then I might turn into Casabon or something. I don't know. We'll see.
You're an American best-selling author, but you also have a very different cultural background than a lot of American writers. There's the French background, the Canadian background. I mean, Canada, we speak English like Americans, but we're not the same kind of people. So I just wonder how much that has influenced or maybe make a difference with your writing.
I think it's part of why I became a writer. I think when I was a kid, we moved around. My father was French from France. My mother was Anglophone Canadian from Toronto. When I was a kid, we moved around a bunch. I was born here, and then we moved to Australia, lived in Sydney, and then to Canada, and then back here. And went always to relatives in France. And I think, you know, part of the writing was I didn't have much I could control. I was just sort of taken around places. So I was like, well, if I make it up, I can control it. I think too that going one of the things about moving a lot is that you have to observe. Like you show up and you have to figure out in every new classroom, like, all right, what are people doing here? What do they listen to? What do they eat? What do they wear? Who do I need to, who do I need to figure out who's powerful, who's less powerful, all that stuff. And that's useful for being a writer. I sometimes think that it's a wonderful gift to have these sort of different aspects of or different identifications. It's also sort of weird because they only make sense to me or my sister, and I think there's no general. People say, I gave a reading in Toronto, and the person who was the very lovely woman who was interviewing me said, well, people seem to suggest that you're a Canadian. Some people seem to suggest that you're a Canadian writer, but of course you're not really, are you? I said, well, I mean, maybe not to you. That part of me is very important to me. Does it have enough? Like, would you brand it with the maple leaf? Like, is it Canadian enough for you? I don't know. And that's true also. That's true. And I feel that one of the things. I mean, there's a much bigger conversation hangs here on, because I feel that I grew up in a world where I believed that sort of hybridity and complexity was where we were all headed, and that we all believed in a future in which that complication was a positive thing, and between the current administration on the one hand and the sometimes isolating silos of very extreme identity politics on the other hand, I feel as though that world that I thought we all felt was a I realized no, that was just a moment in a particular context, in a particular whatever, and there's probably a lot more not belonging in the offing for a lot of people, but all the more reason to write, right?
Thank you so much. Claire will be signing books outside. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Donna, so much. Thank you.
Thank you.